Thank you so much for inviting me to VTech 2020. And you've picked such an incredibly important theme for this conference. And that in a very difficult time for education. In March, 1.5 billion students were locked out of their schools. And that time has left deep traces among students, most notably among the most vulnerable ones. Teachers were able to compensate for some of that through remote learning. But technology doesn't address the many social functions of schools. The time was also challenging for teachers who suddenly were not just instructors, but also coaches, mentors, evaluators, social workers. At the same time, we have seen lots of technological innovation in education, but also important social innovation. And we will need a lot of more of that in the years to come. Just think about digitalization as an incredible force. We can connect and collaborate with anyone. But digitalization has also concentrated power, showing how technology can create scale without mass, leaving people out of the equation. Digitalization can make the smallest voice heard everywhere. You can post something on Twitter and the world can follow you. But it can also squash individuality, cultural uniqueness, making everything in our lives relative. Digitalization can be incredibly empowering. Now, the most influential companies that were created over the past decade, they were not created by a big industry. They were created by a big idea. They had their products before they had their money. At the same time, digitalization can also be incredibly disempowering now. When people trade their freedom in exchange for convenience and become reliant on the advice and even decisions of computers. Education is about striking the right balance. It was just about 10 years ago when we got those little devices into our hands. A few years later, the virtual world and the real world began to integrate and everybody got connected. But there are also shadows of this development. It is the post-truth world, where virality sometimes seems privileged over the quality and the distribution of information. And think about this, in our latest PISA assessment of the knowledge and skills of 15-year-olds, less than 1 in 10 15-year-olds could reliably distinguish fact from an opinion. You can say, well, that's better than it was in the year 2000 when that was just 7%. But once again, we live in a totally different world. And while technology connects everyone, algorithms typically sort us into groups of like-minded individuals. They connect us with people who think like us, who work like us, who look like us, creating echo chambers that amplify our own views but leave us uninformed of opposing arguments that polarize our societies. These forces are real too. Some people have called this a race between technology and education. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, neither education nor technology had a major impact for the vast majority of people. But when the Industrial Revolution pulled technology well above the capabilities of people, it created dramatic social pain. Most people were not ready for the age of machines. But public policy responded and education eventually caught up, making people compatible with the ways of working of machines. It created generations of prosperity. But we became complacent and for a long time didn't change our industrial way of schooling. And suddenly the digital revolution kicked in, now moving technology once again beyond the capabilities of people. And we've seen the same kind of social pain. Bright university graduates having difficulties finding a good job, while employers say we cannot find the people with the skills we need. Our task is to get students once again ahead of the technologies of our times. That is the task in front of us. Our education systems have done well to educate second-class robots, people who are very good at repeating what we tell them. In the age of artificial intelligence, we need to think harder. What makes us first-class humans now? Knowledge is expanding exponentially. And it's filled with so many interesting facets that we could teach and learn. And they all relate to people. Learning is never a transactional process. It's always a relational phenomenon. The one thing that students will remember from this pandemic 10 years from now is the teacher who reached out to them, who was with them when they were locked out from their schools, the teacher who understood their dreams and passions and who helped them realize their ideas in these difficult times. The subjects that you remember from your primary school are probably not, inherent in the disciplines, but basically it's the teacher who brought those subjects across to you, who had a real passion for what they were teaching, who could reach you as a student now. And compared to this rich world, the world of the curriculum is just so small. No? And we're trying to push everything into this little box. No? But what happens is when the rich concepts and ideas of the real world end up in the school curriculum, often they become just very shallow shadows of themselves. No? When you survey fourth graders about science, they're all enthusiastic about it. No? Science is about exploring nature, experimenting, understanding cause and effect. But when you survey 15-year-olds, again, for most of them, science has become a boring world of formulas and equations. It has actually little to do with their world. That's the reality of our curriculum often. And still, we tend to push more and more things into this little box, and even more. In the end, learning often becomes a mile wide, but just an inch deep. The biggest challenge for tomorrow is to teach fewer things at greater depths. Success is about, the realm of human knowledge, the realm of ethics and judgment in a world of artificial intelligence that is just a great amplifier, accelerator. The capacity of people to distinguish between right and wrong and good and bad becomes so crucially important. The realm of creativity, aesthetics and design, to imagine. The realm of political and civic life. Can we live and work together? Those are dimensions that distinguish us from the artificial intelligence we've created in our computers. At the heart of this is building agency, making students not passive learners, but people who can, imagine, create, build their future, who are not afraid of difficulties. Of course, knowledge will always be important. But it's no longer just about the content knowledge, the surface of the disciplines. It's deep understanding of the heart of the discipline. Can you think like a scientist? Not just, remember things from physics and chemistry. Can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? No. History is not about names and places. It's about understanding how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it developed, how it advanced, and sometimes how it unravels when the context changes. And what does it mean for the time in which we live? No? Can you think like an historian? Those are the questions of our times, understanding the foundations of the disciplines. But the world no longer rewards us just for what we know. No? Google knows everything. The world rewards us increasingly for what we can do with what we know. That is the big differentiator. No? The skill dimension. When you think about skills, the first thought maybe goes to cognitive skills. No? Creativity, critical thinking, that are so crucially important. But actually, what the world values more and more are the social and emotional skills of people. Can you imagine? Do you have empathy? Can you relate to people who are different from you? Do you have courage? Do you have resilience? No? Leadership. Those qualities are becoming increasingly important. They're harder to develop, harder to teach, because often they are caught, not taught, in subject matter disciplines. Let me give you a few highlights here. Actually, when you look at the performance of education systems on our international PISA test, the results don't correlate very strongly with money. They don't even strongly correlate with the time that students spend learning. but they correlate very strongly with the growth mindset that young people have. If you go to a country like Estonia, students do well on the PISA assessment. They have very strong subject matter knowledge skills, but they also believe in their own abilities to master success, to overcome difficulties. You contrast this with students in Indonesia, which struggle on the PISA test, but also who believe that success is about their genes, is about talent, something they cannot change on their own. So why would they invest effort in learning? That growth mindset is a crucial determinant of success. And it's not just about, PISA scores, test scores, learning outcomes. We can see that students with a stronger growth mindset are more likely to be motivated to master difficult tasks. They have a greater sense of self-efficacy. They're less afraid of failure. And think about how important this becomes. If we want to have young people who are imaginative, creative, we have to give them space to experiment. If they experiment, they need to take risks. If they take risks, they will make mistakes. The capacity of education systems to help students learn from and with mistakes becomes so crucially important. Students with a stronger growth mindset were also more likely to establish ambitious learning goals and see greater value in schooling. We can even go one step further to the satisfaction of students with their own lives. Did they feel a sense of belonging? Were they happy in their lives? And you might think, well, that's outside the realm of education, but look how strongly what happens in school is correlated with this. Life satisfaction of students was strongly correlated with a positive learning climate. It was clearly negatively correlated with an exposure to bullying. The sense of belonging at school. Is school a place where you make friends, where you feel you belong, where you create identity? Very strong predictor of students' life satisfaction. Where students felt supported by their teachers, where they received feedback by their teachers, where they felt there was a greater collaborative climate of learning. And again, you might think this is about culture. No, actually, the kind of collaborative climate is something which distinguishes education system. You take countries like the Netherlands, like Denmark, like Japan, like Germany, where you can see actually collaboration, cooperation are the dominant features. The grey diamond is on top. You contrast this with other countries, the United States, Malta, Brazil, and the United Kingdom, where competition is at the center. Those are kind of behaviors that actually our education systems can shape in the way we design our learning environments. And once again, in the world in which we live, it's so important to be able to appreciate the different perspectives and worldviews and others, to be able to collaborate with people who think differently from us, who work differently from us. That's something that we looked at the latest PISA assessment as well. You can say, for example, over 2/3 of students say, I sometimes try to understand my friends better by imagining how things look from their perspective. Or I believe that there are two sides to every question and try to look at them both. I try to look at everybody's side of disagreement before making a decision. Also 60%. So you can see students generally try to take the perspective of others. That's what they say. And this is actually something where girls are doing much better than boys. Now, you can see a much higher incidence of girls being or having higher ability to understand the perspective of others. How open are we to people who come from different cultures, who are immigrants? Well, actually, the vast majority of students say immigrant children should have the same opportunities for education that other children in the country have. You can see also 80% among OECD countries say immigrants should have all the same rights that everyone else in the country has. But again, those kinds of attitudes vary across countries. You can see countries like Portugal, like Canada, Korea, where actually the attitude towards immigrants is very positive. Conversely, you look to Hungary, where actually students are quite skeptical about immigrants. And what's interesting, actually, sometimes this is not just about what they experience in school, also what they experience at home at parents. The attitudes of students and parents towards immigrants were very highly correlated. But it's not just about, attitudes. It's also about to what extent are young people willing to engage in open, appropriate, and effective communication across cultures. In this connected world in which we live, in this digital world that tends us to put into silos, into echo chambers, being able to build that kind of bridging social capital is so crucially important. Well, we ask students to what extent they had contact with people from other countries. You can see actually 60% had contact with people from other countries in their circle of friends, a little less in their family. But then school, a very, very important place where students met people from other countries. And as always, that varied across countries. You can take a country like Switzerland, there was this Chinese Taipei, it's a system of Chinese Taipei, where you can see that it being close to 80%, whereas in Vietnam or Brazil, it was just a small minority of students. So that being able to connect with people is very important. And what we can see is actually where young people had contact with people from other countries, they were actually much more interested in learning about other cultures. So sometimes it's not just what we teach in school. We can build that bridging social capital simply by exposing young people more to diverse ways of thinking and working. An important question, obviously, is also to what extent students are building agency regarding global issues. Here are some answers. Looking after the global environment is very important to me. Close to 80% of 15-year-olds are saying so. But actually, when you survey them, can you do something about the problems of the world? Students were more skeptical. That is something that our education systems probably can and need to do better, to give students a real sense of agency, that they do not only have that desire to make a difference, but they feel actually, yes, I can make a contribution. Well, in some areas, their student behavior already signals this. For example, 70% of 15-year-olds say, I reduce the energy I use at home to protect the environment. I keep myself informed about world events via Twitter or Facebook or something like this, 2/3. I regularly read websites on international social issues. I choose certain products for ethical or environmental reasons, even if they are more expensive. Still 45% of students. You can see there is a lot of effort being made on the part of students. And once again, that actually is very closely correlated with what we see from their parents. But let's go one step further. To what extent, do schools actually create a culture that is open to other cultures? Here you can see learning about other cultures at school. In our school, students learn about differences, different culture perspectives on historical and social events. Almost 9 out of 10 school leaders in OECD countries are saying so. That's very positive. But when you look actually what is actually being done, for example, in our school, we celebrate festivities from other countries. That's just a minority. So again, much of that is abstract. We talk about this in lessons, but we don't give school students real exposure to those kinds of ideas. But as always, this varies across countries. You can look at countries like Singapore or Panama or Brazil, where this is actually very, very common. Whereas in Italy, Switzerland or Saudi Arabia, that is actually quite rare. So school systems take a very different approach to actually actively promoting those ideas of diversity. Student exchanges are another instrument. Again, Singapore, Slovenia coming out very strongly on this. Colombia, still a long way to go. Obviously, these things then also become much more expensive. Well, if you ask me, what are the most transformative competencies for tomorrow's world? This has to do with our capacity to create new value, to build something of intrinsic positive worth, to make a difference in this world. It has to do with our capacity to navigate ambiguity, to manage tensions and dilemmas. The world is no longer black and white. Often we need to deal with uncertainty. And last but not least, taking responsibility, mobilizing our cognitive, social, emotional resources to do something, to build something. That is so crucially important. And, technology can be a powerful force to transform education in those directions. The most visible benefit of technology, and we've seen that in the pandemic, is a much greater personalization. While you study mathematics on a computer, the computer can now study you and then make your learning experience so much more granular, so much more adaptive, so much more interactive. You can exchange views, talk with other students anywhere in the world now. The pandemic has brought a small niche out into the mainstream now. Augmented reality, virtual reality, artificial intelligence. They have enormous powers to make learning more social, more fun, more interactive. Assessments and evaluation. Whether you talk about assessments through simulations, hands-on assessments in vocational settings, or machine learning algorithms that are scoring essays. In the past, many educators would complain that testing takes time away from learning or distorts priority in teaching. They're valuing rote learning, the reproduction of subject matter content, while not giving any attention to social emotional skills. Well, in the future, teaching and learning become just one. An assessment will provide students with feedback to learn better, teachers with feedback to teach better, and school systems to get a much better picture of a much broader range of learning environments, including the social and emotional aspects. And then learning analytics holds perhaps the greatest promise. Together with sensors and learning management systems, teachers can now get a real sense of how different students learn differently. Where students get interested and where they get bored, where they advance and where they get stuck. So teachers get a much better sense of how they can structure learning time and which students need what extra support. Once again, teachers need to devote less energy to the broadcasting of knowledge and can devote much more energy to being a good coach, a good mentor, a good facilitator of student learning. Knowing not just, their subject, and how different students learn that subject differently, but also really knowing their students so much better. Again, so important to foster not just cognitive, but also social and emotional capabilities. Well, we need to assess the risks and leverage the opportunities of the technologies of our times. The big threats, the big opportunities. What is the right balance between modernizing and disrupting our education systems? How do we reconcile new goals with old structures? How do we support globally minded and locally rooted students and teachers? How do we foster innovation while recognizing the socially highly conservative nature of education systems? How do we leverage potential with current capacity? How do we reconfigure the spaces, the people, the time, and the technologies to create powerful learning environments? And all of this is not just a government project. It's a whole of society project. This is, I think, what your conference is about. Thank you so much.